Hello everyone and welcome. I would like to start by acknowledging that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota and Dene peoples and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories, we acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. We are extremely pleased to welcome you to the CUCS lecture series, and I'd like to thank St. Paul's College for the space and also the Arthur V. Mauro Institute for Peace and Justice, and Jason Brennan in particular for being instrumental in making this event happen. I'd also like to remind everyone that this conversation is being recorded. So today we are hosting the second lecture and the continuation of a discussion that took place a couple months ago by Dr. Nataliia Stepaniuk, who is our postdoctoral fellow, Petro Jacyk postdoctoral fellow. So a couple words about the fellowship itself. The purpose of the Petro Jacyk fellowship is to annually support one of the most promising junior scholars studying Ukraine or Ukrainian Canadian. And I'd also like to remind everyone that there is still 2 more days to apply for the next 2023-24 fellowship. So the posting will be up for 2 more days until April 15th, and if you haven't had a chance to do so, you can apply on the Young Careers portal. Now, Nataliia, well, it has been such a great pleasure to have you on board as part of the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies and to be able to follow and witness your academic journey. I'd like to provide a brief biography for Dr. Stepaniuk. So Nataliia completed her PhD in political science at the University of Ottawa and has previous background in international relations. Her research focuses on the rise of civilian volunteer networks amidst the war in Donbas and how they have evolved throughout 2022 and 2023. Her broader research interests include post-communist politics, civil society, gender politics, and citizenship. Nataliia has been involved in a lot of amazing projects and publications, and I hope that she'll be able to share more about her important work with you here. Well, Nataliia, without further ado, the floor is yours. Let me pass the microphone as well.
Thank you so much to you, Yulia, and to the Center of the Ukrainian Canadian Studies for organizing this event, and also to you, Jason, and the Mauro Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies for hosting it. I'm also very grateful to all of you who joined us today for this discussion. I know it's Orthodox Easter weekend, and there are other things that you probably have on your to-do list, so I really appreciate you taking the time today to listen about my talk about civilian volunteering in the context of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. As Yulia mentioned during my last talk here at the center, I talked about the emergence of civilian volunteer networks in 2013 after Russia's annexation of Crimea and then the outbreak of violence on Donbas. And today I'd like to expand on this subject a bit and look at how civilian volunteer networks that emerged in 2013 have responded to this new escalation and new wave of violence waged by Russia against Ukraine. More specifically, I want to look how civilian volunteer networks have evolved since 2013, what their current priorities are, what challenges they are facing in this new environment, and also what is the climate of current volunteering and how it differs from 2013. My focus today is going to be on civilian networks that emerged in eastern and southern Ukraine, more specifically in Kharkiv and Odessa. These were the cities where I traveled in 2015 to conduct my initial fieldwork on civilian volunteers. Back then, I spent a couple of months conducting interviews with people who were volunteering in their cities of residence, and the questions that I explored had to do with the process of civilian mobilization, who got engaged, why people decided to volunteer, what were their main practical and ethical preoccupations at that time, but also questions about belonging, and how the outbreak of war in Donbas and volunteer activities influenced their sense of identification with the Ukrainian state, with the Ukrainian nation, their attitudes towards Ukrainian culture, language, and so on. Just by way of providing some context for today's presentation, I wanted to say that what my research showed back then is that the 2013 volunteering brought in a lot of new people into the public sphere, people who had no prior experience of community engagement or public participation. About 90% of my respondents had no prior experience of community involvement before. Local residents mobilized very quickly and effectively, found new ways of collaboration, cooperation, developed very effective networks that were quick to respond to fast-changing war needs back at that time. And the efforts of my respondents primarily focused on addressing the state incapacity to provide for those in most need. And back in 2013, that was the impoverished Ukrainian army and internally displaced individuals. So in my research, I used the concept of limited statehood, the inability of the state to provide core functions such as defense, welfare, programs, and security to sort of describe the environment within which civilian mobilization took place. And what I also observed in 2013 is that for a lot of my respondents, that was really a life-changing experience, not only in terms of obtaining new experience, but also in terms of changing the ways they see themselves, position themselves within society and within the states, and how they relate to others. So a lot of my respondents for the first time came to see themselves as Ukrainian nationals. They strengthened their identification with Ukrainian nation, with the Ukrainian state. They also re-evaluated their attitudes towards Ukrainian language and started to see it in a more positive light. And also the previous forms of belonging, be it the belonging identification with the Soviet Union, with this pan-Slavic space, or identification with their local communities or regional communities, gave way to this national framework of reference. So in my research, I was observing this process of national identity formation from below. And if you look at the literature on nationalism, we know that this is quite common for communities to strengthen their national sentiments in wartime, because national sentiments can act as a quasi-religion that helps people to re-establish the meaningfulness of life in times of profound crisis and loss. So now moving forward from 2013 to 2022, I reached out to some of my respondents that I interviewed back in 2013 and 15, and this time I wanted to explore questions also around their engagement, whether they remained active until and after 2022, how the civilian networks that they were involved with, how these networks evolved and responded to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and current preoccupations and the climate of volunteering. So today I'm going to focus on 3 civilian networks and kind of like make broader reflections about wartime volunteering in Ukraine. The first civilian network that I want to talk about is called the Station Kharkiv. It emerged in Kharkiv in June 2013. It was formed by ordinary citizens of Kharkiv who saw a lot of internally displaced people arriving to their cities and having nowhere to go. At that time, the state did not provide any assistance to provided very little assistance to internally displaced individuals. That was really not the priority given everything else happening in Ukraine. And so people took it upon themselves to first set up just a booth at the train station and provide emergency assistance, such as food, clothing, hygiene products. They later diversified their assistance to provide employment support, integration support, legal advice. They help with the restoration of documents. So they worked in very kind of like they tried to support internally displaced individuals in very diverse ways. When I was conducting my fieldwork in 2015, at that time the organization became quite well developed. It registered as a charity organization, and it managed to develop very effective partnerships with other civilian networks from other regions of Ukraine, but also with international donors, the UNHCR, the diasporas from different countries. So it was really impressive to see this grassroots organization with people who had no prior experience and worked in very different fields before the war, coming together and developing an effective organization that took care. At some point, I think in the summer of 2013, it was 700, 800 people daily that they supported. When there was a lot of, the fighting in Donbas was very intense, and a lot of people were coming to Kharkiv. When I reached out to my respondents in 2023 and asked them about their response to Russia's renewed aggression towards Ukraine, they said that they've been busy even before the invasion happened, because they started getting first inquiries about assistance before February 24, with people from Donbas looking to evacuate in anticipation of that, of Russia's attack. So they've started helping out these people, and then after Russia's first attacks, they started getting requests from local hospitals about assistance with food, with snacks, with gas, and other basic supplies, and they've been doing it on an ongoing basis. On this slide, you can see their assistance provision report from 2022. As you can see, they've managed to provide assistance to a significant number of people. They aided 63,000 individuals in 2022. Their priorities were the provision of food packages, hygiene packages, some financial supports, basic necessities like blankets, pillows, and also medication. So what has changed for this organization compared to 2013? The first thing that was sort of preference throughout my conversations with volunteers was experience. They said that in 2013 they had no experience of volunteering and assistance provision at all. In fact, my respondents said that in 2013 we were like blind kittens, not knowing what to do and where to go. Now we have the experience and a well-established network of volunteers and contacts, and this is something that enabled these volunteers to respond to this new and new wave of aggression in a very effective way, and respond effectively and quickly. Another thing that changed compared to 2013 was the categories of people that they supported. So back in 2013, their focus, for obvious reasons, was the residents of the Donbas region. Kharkiv was among the cities that accepted the highest number of internally displaced individuals during the Donbas war. In 2022, since the start of Russia's invasion, Kharkiv has been under constant shelling, missile strikes, and some parts of Kharkiv were occupied. So there was a lot of precarity that emerged on the ground in Kharkiv itself. So the volunteers of this network expanded their assistance provision to the most vulnerable individuals in their city of residence in Kharkiv, and also to the residents of deoccupied areas in the Kharkiv region. Another thing that was different compared to 2013 is that they started helping out the military. And what enabled that kind of assistance is that the Ukrainian government made legal amendments in March 2022, allowing charity organizations to provide assistance outside of their mandates. So for the Kharkiv, for the station Kharkiv, that's internally displaced individuals. So it enabled organizations to provide assistance outside of their mandates, as long as that assistance was directed towards the Ukrainian Army, the National Guard, or other military units that were involved in defense. So what my respondent mentioned is that it was very important for this organization to do everything in a transparent and accountable manner. And these legal changes enabled them to do just that, to provide assistance to the military, but also be able to do it in a formal and legal way. So what we can observe here is that there is some convergence of assistance provision around military needs as well, and even the organizations that used to focus on internally displaced individuals expanded their work to also include the military. Another thing is that these organizations, having acquired experience from 2013, started have been providing leadership role and started transferring their knowledge to other grassroots organizations that emerged in 2022. So I heard many stories of the volunteers of Station Kharkiv working with volunteers from Ternopil, from Lviv, from Uzhhorod, and sort of like transferring their knowledge of how to procure, deliver supplies, how to make sure that their efforts are, that there is accountability around assistance provision. So they shared that knowledge with less experienced volunteers. And also that's an important leadership function, something that sort of strengthens the capacity of civil society to respond to this new wave of aggression, but it also facilitates the creation of interregional cooperation and mobility. So there are lots of instances, again, where volunteers from the station Kharkiv worked with volunteers from Ternopil, for example. You can see on the photo here, to coordinate assistance and deliver it to those in most need. The next thing that I wanted to talk about is the climate of volunteering in 2022 and how it's profoundly different from the climate that was there in 2014. One thing that is different in 2022 is the scale of displacement in Ukraine is much higher compared to 2014. According to the estimates of the UNHCR, we have 8 million people displaced to neighboring countries outside of the territory of Ukraine, and I think about 5 million people displaced within Ukraine. And of course, that displacement also impacted volunteers themselves. So what my respondent said, that in 2013, we were helping out people who were displaced from the Donbas region, but in 2022, we found ourselves displaced as well. And they had to deal with this new reality of having to move to a different city, settle in, arrange schooling for their children, and of course that takes up a lot of energy and added to the stress of volunteering. And also, given the magnitude of displacement, volunteer networks became regionally spread out, which made coordination, cooperation, setting up meetings a lot more challenging. So there is an added challenge to the functioning of volunteer networks. Another thing has to do with this disruption to normal life. Along with navigating new cities, volunteers have to work through electricity blackouts, internet outages, and other disruptions, which was not the case in 2013, but in 2022, with Russia's targeting of the civilian infrastructure and the electricity infrastructure, that became a new reality for volunteers. You can see on the photo, it's one of my respondents, Yulia from the station Kharkiv, working from a bomb shelter. She was hiding in the bomb shelter for nine days with her daughter when Russia invaded Ukraine, and she said that ever since it has become current occurrence, like a new reality for her to have to hide from missiles attacks and air sirens and so on. So of course this created a lot of disruption for volunteers, and also made the logistics of assistance provision a lot more challenging, because all of a sudden you have to account for gas shortages, you have to account for delays in train schedules, you have to account for other disruptions that were not there in 2013. You also have to take care of your own safety and also the safety of your loved ones. And this is something that my respondents referenced quite often, that their main concern is the well-being of their family, of their relatives, since these people come from eastern and southern Ukraine, and the situation there is very dire. They always have this anxiety about the survival of their loved ones. For Yulia, for example, the volunteer you see here on the picture, her husband has been fighting on the front lines, and that's Yulia is not, of course, alone. Some other respondents of mine have relatives fighting on the front, and they said that it's been just volunteering has become a lot more personal, I'd say, in 2022, because a lot of family members are directly impacted by the war. It has become a lot more traumatic because the scale of loss and grief and precarity has increased, and it has become a lot more, I don't know, like visceral. Like one of my respondents said that she's from the Kyiv region, and she said, well, the building near my building got destroyed. We had people killed in our community, and it's just, she said that I've been constantly immersed in these stories of loss and dispossession and trauma, and this is something that on one hand fuels her volunteering efforts. She talked about volunteering as a way for her to cope with this dramatic situation, but it also drains her personally. So the burnout and psychological distress is very much part of volunteer work. The next volunteer network that I wanted to talk to you about is called Stepaniuk. So this is the network that was created in Kharkiv. Also in 2013, some of the volunteers who got engaged in this network participated in the Euromaidan protest, then after Euromaidan in Kharkiv, and then when the situation in Kharkiv was so volatile and there was a lot of like political and social instability, they just went to the border guards in Kozatsky Liman in the Kharkiv region and asked what kind of assistance they needed, because back then they were actually worried about Russia's full-scale invasion back in 2013, and they knew that Kharkiv would be the first sort of like point for Russia to attack, and they wanted to make sure that the border guards had necessary supplies to defend the region. And my respondents said that they were shocked to find out how lacking the Ukrainian army was at that time. They started with the provision of life-saving vests to border guards, but then eventually they expanded their assistance to the Donbas region and started supporting different military units and so on. So work stopped in 2016 and 17. My respondents said that the intensity of the fighting decreased around that time, and they just didn't see the need to be involved, at least not to such extent. But then in February 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, they were able to revitalize the network and react very quickly to this new escalation of violence in Ukraine. They started providing ammunition, military vehicles. Here on the photo you can see some military personnel receiving drones from this volunteer network. And they said that like one of the things that was different for them in 2022 is that they tried to be more strategic and systemic in their approach with assistance provision. So they tried not, instead of delivering like individual assistance here and there to individual soldiers and combatants, they tried to focus their assistance on making sure that specific military units are combat ready and they have everything to wage a good fight. So this network also referenced the experience they gained in 2014 as something that enabled them to respond very quickly and on a bigger scale. My respondent Kostya said that while he was new to the reality of war in 2014, and he mostly supported other volunteers with more experience and stuff, in 2022 he felt comfortable enough to take up the leadership of the network CUCS. And he's been running it over the last year. In August 2022, this network registered as an NGO. They said that this helped them to provide assistance more efficiently. They were able to purchase military vehicles, collaborate with Nova Poshta, build other partnerships thanks to this change status. So we see here we see the institutionalization of some civilian networks that happened over the last year, and and again, this network, something that I learned is that even though the Ukrainian military army is a lot better equipped in 2022 compared to 2014, there are still a lot of needs on the ground, and civilian assistance is very important. My respondents mentioned policy legislative changes that happened in the Ukrainian military since 2015, increased funding to the military. In fact, the funding has increased by 72% since 2014, according to the estimates of the Stockholm Institute for Peace. So more finances, more training, more. There has been some capacity building, but again, the assistance of civilians is very crucial given the scale of war this time, and the fact that it has become an all-Ukraine war. It's not focused on the Donbas anymore, and that signified another change in the work of this volunteer group. Because initially they focused again their assistance provision on the Donbas region. But because the war has become total, as my respondent mentioned, they started helping out different units across Ukraine. They also built a lot of inter-regional connections, and that interregional mobility and cooperation increased manifolds. And then the last civilian volunteer network that I want to talk about is called Nataliia. So it was formed in Odessa in 2014. It was founded by Tatiana Skaprovska. You can see her on the photo. It's the woman with the glasses. It started as a sort of, they called themselves a cooking battalion. It was founded by local women in Odessa who got together to cook for the Ukrainian military, and then they diversified their supports to also provide uniforms and other basic supplies to those fighting on Donbas. And they actually, within the first year, they created a very efficient network. Their leader, Tatiana, mentioned that they managed to recruit about 1,000 volunteers, primarily women, and they managed to help out over 30,000 soldiers. So I think that is very impressive. Their leader moved out of Odessa to the Kyiv region in 2017-18 for personal and professional reasons. So the network as it existed in 2013 is no longer there. Even a lot of the people who were active in 2013 continue their volunteering efforts. But for Tatiana, just drawing on her experience from 2013, she was able to quickly organize local women in her new community of residents, Nova Petrivka, and so their community was on the fire line in March of 2022. It was between the attacking Russian troops and Kyiv. So they were under a lot of fire, and there were some Ukrainian troops stationed there. So in the first days and weeks of Russia's invasion, they cooked for about 500 military personnel. It was quite impressive because they were able to make something like 260 liters of borscht daily and cook in big quantities to feed the soldiers stationed in their community. And that kind of work required a lot of creativity as well, because it was difficult to purchase groceries from the food store because it was just not there, and also to be able to cook for such a big number of people. But then what Tatiana mentioned is that she didn't see the need to continue that kind of support, because even though there was a lot of disorientation in the first days and weeks of Russia's invasion, eventually food supply chains became well established within the Ukrainian military, and they didn't see the need to continue cooking and stuff. But what Tatiana observed is that there were a lot of people fleeing from Mariupol, Kherson, and other regions to their community. So their little community in Nova Petrivka reoriented their efforts and started helping out IDPs. They opened up a free clothing store in their community, and they also started sending out parcels with clothing and other necessities across Ukraine. So again, it's mostly feminized labor. It's mostly women who get together. She said that they have 15-20 women who do this work daily, but a lot more join on with a different degree of commitment, and they've been doing this work for the last year. So I guess just to sum up my observations of the way civilian volunteer networks have evolved or changed from 2013 to 2022 is that one of the key differences is experience. That a lot of people who started volunteering in 2014 reported having a lot more knowledge, the know-how, contacts, skills, connections during Russia's full-scale invasion compared to the Donbas war. And that, of course, strengthen the resilience of civilians to respond to this new and heightened precarity that was now spread out across Ukraine. So that collaboration and assistance provision has become all Ukrainian, other than focused on the Donbas region. And as a result of it, cooperations, network building, partnerships have also spread out geographically. Something that in my previous research I saw as important in terms of that creating that sense of national unity. Because before the Donbas war, there were a lot of regional stereotypes of people from Kharkiv, about people in Lviv, or people in Ternopil, about people in Odessa, but that in war-driven inter-regional mobility and cooperation, erased a lot of that stereotypical thinking and contributed to the consolidation of the we feeling around the nation, that we're all Ukrainians and we're going through this horrible experience as Ukraine instead of like specific regions. I've observed some convergence of assistance provision around military needs. As I mentioned, even Station Kharkiv, that was solely focused on the provision of humanitarian aid to IDPs, have now started providing assistance to the military. So that has to do in part with legislative changes introduced by the Ukrainian government, but also with that recognition that it's the military that, for Ukraine to survive as a country and for Ukrainians to survive as people, to support the military as much as we can. So that definitely the status of the military has risen over the last year. That civilian-military bond has strengthened. Also, I've been observing the process of militarization happening in civilian communities. Something, if you look at the literature on war and militarization, is quite common, especially for communities that are fighting for survival. And of course, as I mentioned, this time around, volunteering is a lot more personal, traumatic, but that also feeds into strengthened, I guess, commitment and dedication to do whatever it takes. For example, Stepaniuk, the volunteer network that I talked about, they have on their website, their motto is that we help from 2013 until victory. And they explain that even if that takes years, we are committed, we are not going to give in. So the commitment and dedication is there, and my respondents really frame this volunteer work in terms of survival, existential. It has now this existential importance, as one of my respondents said. This is not 2014. This is a life or die situation when either everyone gets involved or we are all dead. Right now, we must understand that someone else's life depends on our actions. Our life depends on it too. We must stand strong right now, like soldiers are standing strong for us. And also, volunteering provides space for people to regain a sense of control amidst all this trauma and suffering, and feel empowered through their actions. So Costa, a volunteer from CUCS, said that I have found a meaning in life thanks to volunteering. Outside volunteer work, I'm a successful person, I own a business, I have hobbies, playing drums and traveling. My hobbies and work make me an average person, like everyone else. Through volunteering, I feel like I'm shaping the course of the history. I feel like I haven't wasted my life. So, as we see, the dedication and commitment is very strong. And on that note, I'd like to finish my talk, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you so much. And now I'd like to open the floor for discussion. So if you're here in the auditorium, feel free to raise your hand and I'll call on you. And if you're joining us online, you can type your question into the Q&A chat box, and we'll make sure to address as many questions as possible during today's session.
Okay. My name is Roman Jacyk. I'm a business scholar here at the University of Manitoba. Thank you. It was a very informative presentation. I'm just curious because I didn't attend your previous lecture. So I'm just curious about, I suppose that you studied before different volunteers movement in Donbas, yes? In Donetsk, Luhansk regions, because you now only focus on Kharkiv and Odessa. I'm just curious what happened to them. Did you have any kind of contact? Were you able to collect any data? What's going on with this? Because Mariupol was like one of the biggest center of different kind of volunteer movements. Yes, I'm just curious when they were displaced, etc. What's going with them? Maybe you have any data. Just curious. Thank you.
Should I respond right away, or do you want to take more questions and then get a response?
Well, we could respond to this question, but I would like to add to that the first presentation is available online on YouTube, so you can view it if you wish on the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies YouTube page. And I'll let Nataliia address.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. My research in 2013 and 2015 focused on Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, and Odessa. That's where I recorded my interviews. I interviewed about 100 volunteers, so I didn't explore the volunteer movement in the Donbas itself, and also not in Mariupol for a number of reasons. In 2015, when I conducted my fieldwork, it wasn't safe enough to go in certain parts of the Donetsk region and conduct interviews. Also because I saw this huge civilian mobilization happening in Kharkiv, happening in Odessa with pro-Ukrainian civilian groups getting together. And that was a new phenomenon for these regions, known for its kind of like ambiguous national identification and also a lack of enthusiasm for the Maidan protests. I don't know, there was a lot happening, and I wanted to get a better sort of grasp on the developments on the ground. So I mostly focused on these three cities.
Thank you.
Nataliia, would you like to go next?
Yes, I would like to ask a question, maybe like your personal attitude to organizations who were doing like their volunteer work without being registered as a charity organizations, because like aligned with this terrific work what they are doing, there were like some fraudulence were increased, unfortunately, and like some people presented them as volunteers and like just erasing their money.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like how.
Well, that was actually, I'd say that was the reality back in 2013, and probably still the reality in 2022, that a lot of the volunteer work happens outside of any formal organization. The organization that I talked about today, the Station Kharkiv, it could be a bit of an outlier just because they've grown so big. They started from this grassroots initiative, but they built a lot of partnerships with international donors as well, and for them to be able to receive aid from international partners, they have to be registered and they have to do everything in an accountable way. So in that sense, they could be a bit of an outlier. I know other organizations that follow the same route. For example, there is another organization in Odessa. They're called Korporacja Monsters Corporation. They've grown very big. They started in 2013 as well, initially helping out orphans coming from the Donbas region, and now they're primarily assisting the military, and it's very impressive what kind of funds they're able to collect. They enjoy very high levels of social support as well. There are people who've been donating to them for years. They also work with the UNHCR and a lot of other international organizations, but the reality is that a lot of these grassroots initiatives never got officially registered because first, they don't necessarily have resources. That registration comes with additional labor that has to be invested into this. You need to know how to run an organization. And it might not just be a priority for them at this moment, you know. So it's usually when organizations really expand and grow big, there is a point in their development and capacity building where they decide that it's worth it. But for smaller initiatives, they just work very informally, and they usually just leverage private connections, their friendships, their university friends, you know, as an infrastructure to collect resources and deliver. And this personal relationships have been that crucial for the functioning of volunteer networks. This is something that I discussed in my research back in 2013, because some literature says that private ties are not good for participation, because they make people kind of like stay in their bubbles, you know, and they inhibit broader participation. They make networks uncivil in a way that people don't go outside of their immediate friendship circles to connect to others. But in times of crisis, in times of war, I saw those personal connections as really crucial for very fast mobilization. In Ukraine, there was also a lack of trust, and culture when it comes to broader participation. So private ties is something that help people to overcome that lack of trust. And you referenced that in your question, that there are some abuses when it comes to volunteer work, as is always the case. But based on my research, I can say that volunteering is also a trust-generating activity, that people have actually started trusting others more. And we can say it even from public surveys, the fact that volunteers enjoy a very high level of trust. I remember the data from 2015, where volunteers were the most kind of like trusted institution of Ukraine, even exceeding or maybe being close to the church, and having a lot more trust compared to, let's say, the government, the parliament, and other institutions. So of course, I mean, some of that abuse is present when civilian mobilization happens at this scale. Some people find a way to take advantage, but overall, I find volunteering builds trust rather than.
Thank you, answer.
I'll read what I posted online. So here in Edmonton, some displaced Ukrainians are helping to set up volunteer networks. And I know your research is not focused on what's happening in Canada, but I am curious whether there might be a connection between the volunteer network set up here. And the one I'm thinking about is the free store for Ukrainian newcomers. And you had mentioned free clothing stores. I think it was in Odessa. These are, I think they're set up by Edmontonians, but they're run in part by Ukrainian volunteers. And I wonder whether there would be a connection in terms of that experience you talked about going back to 2014, whether those shape the way that volunteer networks form within overseas diaspora and displaced communities. And if you haven't looked at any of that stuff, which I don't imagine you would have given the focus of your research, but I wonder if you think that's a possibility. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks for your question, Jeffrey. I think you're right. I think there is a lot of sort of knowledge transfer, perhaps even from Ukraine to now Canada, in the way assistance is organized in the Ukrainian community and some of the initiatives that emerge. So it's not just the experience of specific people, but the experience or the creation of certain initiatives back in 2013 that has now been taken as a blueprint to create similar initiatives, either a free clothing store or some other supports that displaced individuals need. I think a lot of people are drawing on that experience that emerged in 2013 and then sort of evolved from that time. People who come from Ukraine to Canada definitely come with the knowledge of how civilian assistance was organized in Ukraine and bring that knowledge and implement it in their new communities of residents as well. And another, I guess, sort of like thing that I wanted to mention, you said that in Edmonton, a lot of internally displaced persons started volunteering in their new communities, and it was exactly the same sort of the same thing that I observed in Kharkiv and Odessa, where internally displaced persons who initially came for assistance eventually started volunteering themselves as a way to express their gratitude to for the assistance that they had initially received, or as a way to integrate it into their new communities. You know, volunteering is also a great way to build contacts, to get to know people. So they saw it as like when you arrive to a new community, you virtually know nobody, and like volunteer spaces are the spaces that are welcoming enough. There is always need for extra pair of hands, and you can make connections. You can ask questions about employment. You can ask questions about childcare. So a lot of internally, a good number of internally displaced persons became volunteers themselves in their new communities.
Thank you, Natalia.
I appreciate your work, dear Natalia. Volunteering is a necessary component of every civil society. And I would like to ask you, have you involved in your research those volunteers who worked outside of Ukraine, in Canada, for example? But I heard your answer to previous question. Maybe you can involve in your research the volunteering activity which is reflected in social media, such as Facebook, Twitter, and another. For example, the Facebook group Ukrainians of Manitoba regularly organize fundraising for Ukraine. So it's only a recommendation. I would like to to say you that I so thank you, and I am grateful for such relevant research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olga. It's a very good suggestion as I'm thinking of ways to sort of expand on my research and about the next stage of it, as I also can no longer travel to Kharkiv right now or Odessa, and I'm located in Ottawa, and there's a lot of work happening there as well. I have been involved not in an academic capacity, but as a community member. I've been volunteering myself with the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, Ottawa branch, and also with other initiatives. So it definitely presents new sort of like areas and venues for research. Something that I will consider in the future. But in 2013, I was really just focused on eastern and southern Ukraine, because I felt that it's not only that the civilian mobilization itself that was new and a new phenomenon and very interesting thing to study, but also those other changes that accompanied volunteering, like that national identity formation, how people started identifying themselves with Ukraine, how other forms of belonging dissolved amidst this war. I look at the turning points, like what made people to rethink their identification and belonging, how they articulated their new ways of thinking, how they re-articulated their responsibilities as citizens or community members, new types of solidarities that emerged in volunteer spaces. So I just found those regions to be a very rich space for study and reflection. And also, one last thing that I wanted to add, I felt that because I conducted ethnographic work, so it wasn't just interviews, but also participant observation of volunteer work. I attended different initiatives. I accompanied some volunteers as they delivered aid on the front, and I felt that there was sort of like a lack of that kind of observations, because we know we get some indications about the strengthening of national identifications through large-scale surveys, through questionnaires, but it's really that observation and immersion in these communities that gives us a much better sense of the changes that are happening amidst war and how communities mobilize and what kind of other changes accompany that mobilization.
Thank you, Nataliia. I'd also be curious if you could unpack for us the relationship between the volunteers, the military, and the states, and the role of volunteers as sort of an informal organ of accountability for the government. You know that there have been a couple cases where the volunteer efforts and the journalist efforts were instrumental in making change happen, so it would be good to hear what you think about this particular aspect.
That's a very interesting and multi-dimensional question. It would take a lot of unpacking for me to provide a nuanced answer. So I know that we're almost out of time. I'll keep my comments brief. But what I noticed is, and this is something that started in 2013 and perhaps became even more intense in 2022, is that civilian-military bond. That civilians that help out the military, they have like a strong sense of loyalty and commitment. It just goes beyond some like practical assistance. That civilians also invest a lot of emotional labor into their engagement. So like some literature talks about like non-state agents that conduct or like fill in for the state as like functional equivalents of the state. I think in the case of Ukraine, volunteers really go beyond that because they invest a lot of emotions, a lot of affection, expression of gratitudes to keep the morale of the military high. So, so I think that like relationship between the civilians and the military is very strong. Some consequences of that is, of course, that the boundaries become at times blurry. Who is a civilian, who is the military, how do we identify these things, and of course the militarization of civilians, which is, you know, for the country and communities fighting for survival is understandable, but it also comes with a lot of like concerns, let's say, because like peaceful life and like civilian life becomes like seen through the military lens, and military values become spread out way beyond the front line. And I think this is like something that Ukraine will have to face once this military part of war is over. I think this is something that we have to deal later on. In terms of the relationship between volunteers and the state, I noticed that a lot of these volunteer initiatives or volunteer organizations sort of function autonomously from the state, and they don't really engage with the state. There is a lot of, they always talk about the state, and they are very cognizant of the fact that a lot of the work that they are doing, or it's at least like in their perception or imagination, it should be done by the state. So there's a lot of criticism of that, and some thinking of how to actually enable the state institutions to do their functions properly, because they do recognize that the way things work right now, it's not really sustainable long term. People cannot just spend 12 to 13 hours daily conducting all these functions that are supposed to be the functions of state institutions. So I'll leave it here for now.
Well, I'm afraid we are running out of time, so I really appreciate your answer, and I think we will stop the session at this point, the recorded part of the session. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and please stay tuned for the events that will be taking place. In particular, next week, we have a lecture on the gifts of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in the organizing of which Nataliia herself was really instrumental, and it will be done in collaboration with the UCC Ottawa. A Ukrainian language interpretation will be provided, so I highly encourage that all of you join us if you're able to. It will be broadcast online as well. So thank you, everyone, and happy Easter if you're celebrating this upcoming weekend.
Thank you so much.